All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Frank Fogarty, and on behalf of the Wildlife Department, I'd like to welcome you to our Next Generation Wildlife Ecoseries. Our Next Generation Wildlife Ecoseries is aimed at highlighting the achievements and amplifying the voices of early career wildlife biologists. This next generation of scientists is more diverse than the community of natural resource scientists as a whole. However, we recognize that systemic racism continues to impose barriers for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC, who are seeking careers in natural resources. So this series will not only spotlight the professional achievements of BIPOC scientists, who can be role models for this next generation, but it also serves as a forum to discuss how our field can move forward to reduce barriers and become a more inclusive community. The Wildlife Department is committed to challenging the status quo in the discipline and to propelling a more diverse next generation of wildlife biologists. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Barbara Klukas to introduce our speaker for today.
All right, thanks, Frank. Yeah, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jen Hunter. We went to graduate school together back at UC Davis back in the early 2000s. We were just chatting before you guys all got in here about how long ago that seems, but also seems like just yesterday because it was so much fun. And so Jen was in the ecology graduate group, and she did her research on looking at skunks and how other species respond to their coloration and size, and did some really cool work, got to do some taxidermy. But I'll let her talk more about that. And after finishing her PhD, she worked at UC Berkeley, and then is now the director of the Hastings Reserve, also through UC Berkeley. So I'm really excited to hear about what she's going to be talking about today. So I'll turn it over to her, and yeah, I look forward to it.
All right, let me do this thing. I probably should have done this. Is that like okay? Okay, perfect. Yep. Thank you so much to Frank and Barbara for inviting me here to do this. I was telling them before the meeting started that I kind of struggled with developing this talk a little bit, because it's a little bit outside sort of the typical sort of Hastings spiel that I give. And it was kind of a challenge, and it made me think a lot about the way I do my job and the way I see my job, and then how that kind of fits within sort of the broader context of field stations and then the UC Natural Reserve system, of which Hastings is a part. So, it's going to be kind of a two-pronged approach today. So the first part, I'm going to give kind of a general overview to the UC Natural Reserve system and Hastings Reserve sort of broadly. And then part two is going to be a little bit more personal, and I'm going to talk about the job and why it's the greatest job in the world, and why I encourage everybody to do this job at some point. Because when I was a grad student, I didn't fully understand the various pathways that were available to me as a graduate. And so I kind of felt a little bit aimless for a while, trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And so I really encourage folks to think about natural resource management in different ways. And so I'll give you some examples of that today. So I'll get started by talking about the UC Natural Reserve system. So it's abbreviated UC NRS. And what it is, it's a collection of 41 different field stations that are found all throughout the state. So they're in all of our various ecosystems, from the Mojave Desert to the Central Coast, to the North Coast, to the High Sierra. There's the White Mountain Research Center that's at like 11,000 feet or 12,000 feet in elevation in the High Sierra. And they're really, really diverse places, and they're set aside specifically for research and education. And that's kind of beneficial in a couple of ways. One, so when I was a grad student, I used the reserve system. And it was terrific because I could go to these places and I could put out expensive equipment, and I knew it was going to be there when I went back to check for it. So these are not places that are typically open to the public. And the ethos kind of around the reserve system is really it's very focused on stewardship. Specifically of the earth and its natural systems, and basically fostering an environment where graduate students and undergrads and even K through 12 students have an opportunity to come and experience these places sort of in its natural settings. So typically these places have a very, very light human footprint. And Hastings is no different. So Hastings Reserve, which is the best of the 41, and I say that empirically, it's the best one, so we're located in central, like coastal California. We're administered by the University of California, Berkeley. And we're, let's see, so we're sort of southeast of Monterey Bay. So this is Monterey Bay here. This is where we're located. We're 19 miles as the crow flies from Big Sur. So Big Sur is just right over here. We're 2,500 acres in size. We maintain 26 buildings for a total of 44,000 square feet of interior space, which may not be particularly meaningful on its own, but I say that just to amplify that it's a lot of places and it's a lot of maintenance. And so it's actually quite a large facility. We've got 10 houses that people stay in. We've got barns and storage sheds and tractors and quads and all these sorts of implements that we can use to help support research and education. And so this is kind of the shape of the reserve. We're on all sides, it's private land. So to our east and to our west are big ranches that run cattle. And there's some residential homes here, but for the most part, we're in a really rural agricultural area. And I'll just talk a little bit about the Hastings family. So it's kind of an interesting origin story. They bought this property. I've seen photos where they look happier. They look pretty miserable here, but I think that's a outlier. I hope it is. They bought the property in 1926. It was 1,600 acres at that time. They're from a fairly wealthy family. So they traveled all over the world. He worked for Standard Oil. She came from a sort of wealthy family on the East Coast. And so they were fairly well off, and they bought the ranch initially as kind of a hobby farm. They had one child, their daughter Fanny, who spent a lot of time out here. I'm not going to talk about the schoolhouse that we have on site, but we have a building on site that functioned as a schoolhouse in the 20s and 30s. It was a boarding school, and she attended school there. So she was kind of all in on the lifestyle out here. Hastings connected with Berkeley through this woman, well-armed woman on the left here. Her name is Amy Alexander. And she was a naturalist and a philanthropist. She was actually the heir to the C&H sugar fortune. And she spent a lot of her time traveling through the West. And she did a lot of collecting. She was really into the natural history and the natural world. And she ended up starting the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley. And then this guy here, his name is Joseph Grinnell. He was kind of the first director of the MVZ. And so in our world, these two are pretty central characters because they kind of got the toehold of Berkeley in here through a social connection. So they met the Hastings family at a party. At the time, Joseph Grinnell was working at Point Lobos, documenting the flora and fauna of the Central Coast. And the Hastings family invited him out here for a visit, and they granted access to Berkeley to use this place as a field station in 1937. And so if you read what he says here, that he's basically imagining Hastings as a place where students of ornithology, mammalogy, botany, entomology, ecology, etc., can study local flora and fauna. And the kind of the ethos around this place was with the absence of sort of the human presence on the landscape. So I'm going to put this up again because while Hastings precedes the NRS, so the NRS didn't become a network until 1970. So we're kind of the oldest reserve that was sort of folded into that network when it began. You can see that sort of the ethos of the NRS is basically the same, and this element of stewardship of the earth and its natural systems. And the reason I highlight this is really just to kind of make a So historically, when we talk about Hastings and sort of the Hastings origin story, we end up talking about this site as though everything that happened here before the Hastings arrived on the scene is sort of unimportant or not critical to the condition of the site and the work that we should be doing here. And so this historically was a site that the Esselyn Indians inhabited. They're one of the first tribes that are considered sort of like culturally extirpated by the Spanish colonizers. It was a small band, and they lived at pretty low density, but they were really active here. And we see evidence of them all the time. So everywhere around Hastings are these mortars. We have these bedrock mortars in one spot where there's a huge granite stone, and you can see all of the mortars there. We actually have the confluence of 3 creeks here, which was an important place for these folks to fish and to gather acorns and to forage in general. So this picture on the right is actually a rock wall that was built sometime in the last 2,000 years. And it's still here and it's still standing. And one of the reasons that the way that we manage the landscape is so helpful for cultural sites like this is that we don't have cattle, we're not planting row crops. You know, these structures can remain standing without the disturbance of sort of livestock trampling them and you know, conflicting needs in terms of land use. And so I think broadly the NRS is moving toward a direction of trying to integrate sort of the cultural resources and the cultural heritage part of these places into sort of our broader mission. I think all of the events of this last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the sort of attention that was paid to inequities, like systemic inequities in the system, has really made people reflect on sites like Hastings and how we can serve multiple purposes, and we can be stewards of more things than just the natural system. So we can be stewards of the cultural history as well. And so that's something that's really important to me personally. We've made a connection with the Esselyn tribe of Monterey County, and they come out now and they do prayers and they have cultural events out here. And we're planning to kind of build upon that partnership going forward and make sure that they feel and we feel like they're integrated back into this landscape. And I think that that brings a real value for the students and researchers that come here, because it places all of the things that are around us kind of in a broader context. And it allows people to see the way that Hastings functions and the ecotypes and the ecosystems and the way that the animals and people historically interacted. Because it's not quite fair to say that, you know, prior to 1926, there were no people in the landscape, because that certainly wasn't the case. So we have the cultural history from the indigenous people. We also have a significant homestead history here. So Hastings at some point, depending on who you ask, is a collection of somewhere between 6 and 16 separate homesteads. And so we maintain several buildings here. I guess, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that were built in the 1860s. So the building on the left is the Arnold Homestead. I wish I could say that it looks bigger from a different angle, but it really isn't. So there was a family that lived here. They had 5 children. The children slept underneath the building here with the livestock. It's a 2-bedroom house inside. There's a small kitchen space. It's on the side of a hill, and historically was only accessible via a single track path. And so all of the materials that came up, I mean, not the aluminum roof, but all the original materials came up on horseback or on mules. And it's a real weird site to think to build a house, but there's a spring just behind this tree. And that, you know, source of water was so critically important. You know, we have creeks here, but they're seasonal creeks. That this is where this family decided to settle. We also have the Scot Homestead, which is kind of very central to our buildings. This is sort of like the central area of the reserve. This was built in the 1860s as well. And we also have the original cabin and the workshop that go kind of along with this homestead. So, so our responsibility here, at least the way that I see it, is to be stewards of the landscape and all that came before. And so, you know, we really want to be able to highlight to our users sort of the full history of the site. And, you know, there were important players in that history. So the Arnold Homestead yielded this guy. So this guy's name is Tom Arnold, and he turns out to be a fairly pivotal player in the Hastings family story. So this is him, Tom here, and 3 of his siblings. There were actually, there's one more. And Tom grew up in that little house, and he became ultimately the ranch manager at the ranch when the Hastings family bought it. And, you know, there's a lot of story between this place and where I'm taking you now. But he ended up marrying Fanny Hastings, the only daughter of the Hastings family. It was a huge scandal at the time. They were married in 1935. Tom was 33. He was divorced. He had children from a previous marriage. Fanny was 18 and from the super wealthy family. And actually, one of their children told me that he thinks the Hastings family left the property to UC Berkeley because they didn't want Tom to get it. So, you know, there's always like a backstory. It's a little bit, you know, soap opera. But I think it's critical to understand like the complexity of the people who were living here at that time, and to kind of value all of their stories and all of their ugliness and all of their beauty. So at any rate, they had 5 children, and those kids continue to support the reserve today. So this little guy, Jesse Arnold, is now this man. And he actually, I just yesterday put down a deposit on a brand new tractor because Jesse gave us $40,000 to do that, which is one of the more important implements that we have here on the reserve. But you know, so it's really important to maintain those family connections and to be able to show value at a place like this and to keep people engaged. So to the Arnold family, this site is sort of the central point of their family's story. And so by treating it with respect and reverence, we can, you know, continue to maintain those relationships over the years for the benefit of all of us. So enough with the whole Hastings backstory. I'll tell you a little bit about what happens here. So I went back through our reservation system to the last normal year, which was 2018-2019. And I looked at all of the users that came here. And you can see we have a huge range of groups that come here, from universities to community colleges, the Western section of the Wildlife Society. We have international universities that come here, agencies like CDFW and NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and even down to the Boy Scouts of America. We really have a really diverse user group. And I think that diversity helps us really develop a plan. Me specifically, you know, we do a lot of interaction, particularly when we have classes come. There's a lot of interaction between me and the students, and sort of understanding sort of the broader student experience, both because I lived it and then also interacting with these students coming from different places. It really helps to figure out the stories that really resonate with students, and it helps with the storytelling element of the job, which is actually pretty significant. You can see we have like 1,000-ish users a year, and we calculate their use in terms of user days. So how many days they're here and how many beds we have full sort of through the course of the year. So we get pretty significant use. I think we're probably in the upper maybe quarter of field stations in the system, and the amount of use that we get. And a lot of our users come from courses. So college classes, we get K through 12 students through here. And they vary really from field courses and methods courses to sort of high school and middle school science classes. And we really try to foster a lot of interaction with the researchers that are here. We try to expose the students to kind of to the whole process of fieldwork and developing research projects, and you know, kind of suffering through some of the parts of it that are hard and some parts of it that are really gratifying, and to kind of give them an experience and hopefully kind of inspire some of these students to go on to do careers like this in the future. And so one important element of this, so the K through 12 students that come usually just come for the day, and the college classes usually stay overnight. So we have a class that comes and stays for 2 weeks. We have a lot of classes that stay for 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights, kind of along those lines. And the reason we can accommodate all that is because we have a ton of housing. We have, all told, we have 74 beds that people can stay at when they come here. And they're spread between 11 different housing units. We have some really high capacity places, like the ranch house that was built in 1899. It's the original ranch house that the Hastings family lived in when they were here. And that sleeps 22 people. We've also got the schoolhouse building that sleeps 16. So typically when classes come, they'll be sort of split between those two buildings. But the accommodations are great. You know, they're fully functioning houses with kitchens and bathrooms and heat and hot water and laundry facilities and all that kind of stuff. So essentially, they're fully functioning normal houses. I mean, some are slightly more rustic than others, but it's a pretty comfortable place to stay and do field work. And one thing I should have mentioned when I started talking about the reserve system is, you know, we get all excited about the research element and the education element. And for me as a grad student, the most exciting part was that they're super cheap places to stay. And so they range a lot in price, and we're one of the more expensive reserves because we have so many facilities to maintain. But we charge $17 to $20 a night per person for education and research users, and we jack it up to $50 a night for professional users. But for the most part, you know, you get internet service, laundry, kitchens, all that kind of stuff. It's a pretty easy experience, and it's a nice bridge for students that don't have a lot of history or a lot of comfort being in really remote areas and having to sort of build the fire and cook your own food over a fire and the tent camping and all that stuff. If people aren't comfortable with that or need kind of an intermediary step between normal life and camping or backpacking someplace, these places really can provide a nice bridge for folks like that. We also have a bunch of other facilities, workshops, wood shops, we've got barns, we have a little museum that needs a lot of work, but could be a really cool spot for highlighting the natural history of the area. We've got a conference room. So we have kind of all of the really important elements, and we have groups come to be able to meet and gather and do what they need to do. So we get, in addition to the education users and the researchers, we also get a lot of workshops and things like that come through. And so I'll talk a bit about the research use. And I was trying to figure out how best to encapsulate the range of research that's been done here. And so I did a Google Scholar search earlier today for Hastings Reservation, and it came up with almost over 1,000 publications that mention the reserve. So Hastings has really been a critical place of research for a lot of different projects. Most well known is this project on Acorn Woodpeckers, which has really been one of the seminal projects on cooperative breeding in birds. We're in our, I believe, 53rd consecutive year of collecting data on Acorn Woodpeckers. And so if anybody wants to know anything about Acorn Woodpeckers, let me know. But so we really, this project is really sort of central to the work that's been done here. And so this kind of collection of pictures are just what folks are studying who have been here in the last 2 weeks. So a couple of plant folks, wild cucumber, baby blue eyes. We've got a group that's doing genomics work on black oaks. And then we've got folks studying bullocks, orioles, Allen's hummingbirds. We've got 2 different people studying tree frogs, one from UC Santa Barbara, one from San Francisco State. And then we have so many people that study ticks. You know, it bothers me a little bit that we're such a great place to study ticks, but ticks and poison oak are really our 2 highest use things. But at any rate, then this is just the species-specific projects. We also have a lot of projects that are interested in kind of community level interactions in oak woodlands. We have a group from California Department of Fish and Wildlife who is responsible for censusing all of the terrestrial wildlife in California. And so they're trying to develop a methodology that will allow them to do that using the minimal amount of equipment that has to be hauled all over the state. So there's that group. And then there's another group that's studying the effects of fire on the landscape. And I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. I'm gonna skip this video because it's kind of long, although it's wonderful. on Acorn Woodpeckers. And I just kind of want to highlight a couple of the projects that have happened here in the past. So this fascinated me. So this is our California mice, which are everywhere, including in our cars and in our houses and all that kind of stuff. They're adorable. They have these huge Dumbo ears. They're like the cutest mice you've ever seen in your life. And there was a group here from UNC that was studying their ultrasonic vocalizations that they make. And so they experimented. So they're monogamous species. And so they separated the male, and they captured both male and female. They separated them for some period of time and then put them back together and recorded the vocalizations that they made when they were put back together again. And so when they're separated for a little while, they put them back together. These are the sounds they make. Which is wonderful. So who knew mice could make sounds like this? And then they separated them, and they put the female in with another male for a brief period of time, and then they put them back in together. And this is what the sounds sound like. So that's a very unhappy mouse. And they get back to their sort of like lovey whale song sounds eventually. But, this is the kind of stories that I love. It's like these little unexpected findings that, can be quite academic if they're not pitched in the right way. But when you present them to people in a way where they can relate to the mouse, I suppose, it's really a way to help people sort of respect the mice a little bit more. So they're broadly considered nuisance species here, I mean, to an extreme degree. But when you start trying to sort of share sort of these aspects of their behavior and their life history, people like public audiences and stuff that I speak to come away with sort of like a newfound affection for the mice. So one of the things that's really important to the job here is to be able to communicate with the public, in a way to help them sort of foster that interest in the natural world, to help them learn about these species that are around them every day, and to help them kind of hone their observational skills a little bit, and to look for some of the species and the signs and the behaviors that we tell them about. So that's just one example. And then I'm gonna skip through, sorry, mice. There's also the potential for more research here. So in August this year, this fire started with all of those lightning strikes. It's called the river fire. This is the smoke plume I saw, I think it was like August 18th or something, but it's 15 miles away from where I was standing at this moment. And then 3 days later, it was here. And so about 600 acres of the reserve burned. It was a very exciting couple of days. But it really provides an opportunity to try to capture some of the changes that happen in the landscape sort of with the burn and then in the months and years following the burn. So there was an effort that the reserve system put together to do some basic surveys of vegetation, of soil, of the insect communities. But to me, it felt like a real missed opportunity if we didn't try to capture some of the changes in the mammal communities. And so I put some cameras out. So I've got 6 cameras in the burned area, 6 cameras in the unburned area. And we replicated a study design that was developed for a similar project at the Hopland Reserve, or Hopland Agricultural, oh God, what does the ANR stand for? Agricultural and Natural Resources Station. So, so the idea is to put these cameras out and continue to monitor these sites for the next couple of years to see what happens. We have a student that's just in the next couple of weeks going to come and start changing out the SD cards and really start cleaning the images and analyze that data ultimately. But the game plan is to really have a camera grid that covers the whole reserve. There's no specific purpose behind that other than to just document change over time. And that's one of the things that we do best here, because these borders are always going to be our borders. The land use isn't going to change. So there's that continuity over time that you don't always get in a setting like this. And so, you know, those data I'm planning to make available to students who are interested in analyzing it. You know, one of the things that I can do here is to provide opportunities for students and help provide some of the basic infrastructure, cameras, equipment, that kind of stuff, to allow them to do work that's interesting to them. Let's see. So, okay, so we're going to transition to part 2, the life of a field station director. This is me just after, well, in the midst of the fire, trying to assess myself and my feelings. And, you know, so I started working at the field stations when I was in grad school. I did this crazy study making taxidermy mounts of skunks and gray foxes. And I put them out in these natural areas and tried to record the behavior of predators that visited these animals. And it was kind of a crazy study, and it was kind of a lot of stuff. So I was putting out cameras, I was putting out these taxidermy mounts, and it was really important to me that those things not get stolen or vandalized, because I was a grad student, I had no money to do any of this. And so the reserves really were the place where I was like, oh my God, it's super cheap to work here. There are these huge tracts of land. The access is really good. There's not a ton of users. So, you know, I can set my stuff up along a road and not have to worry about people running things over. Like it just seemed like the perfect place to do this stuff. And so when I started working in the field stations, this sort of light switched in my brain, and I was like, this is the thing I want to do. So when I started grad school initially, it took me like a week to realize I did not want to be a professor, because what I wanted to do was be outside. Apologies to all professors in the room. I wanted to be outside all the time. I wanted to be around people, like interacting with the public and stuff. And so the field stations really seemed like they kind of hit all the boxes, right? You can do your own research. You can build these programs focused on things that are important either to the station or to you personally. And you can kind of help, I don't know, it's like this personal investment in the land in a way that really, like, I feel a tremendous sense of responsibility for Hastings. I've only been here 2.5 years, but I feel like that's really the sort of stuff that I'm interested in. And so when I started watching these field station managers and how they were operating and the stuff that they were doing, it really was something that made me think long and hard about what I wanted to do with my career. And so just to give you an idea of what I do, I'm going to play this because I love it. So I do everything. So my day-to-day is everything from research to fundraising to building maintenance to fence repairs. I do event planning, the wireless networking and managing our Wi-Fi network. And we have like 18 radios just within, I don't know, maybe a mile of here, another 6 or 7 that are a couple of miles away, and trying to manage all those connections and make sure people have Wi-Fi. It sounds super boring. It is super boring, but it's a critical part of making this place function. And so all of that kind of stuff kind of falls to me. And so to say every day is a new day, every day is different, is like a massive understatement. And so I love it because that means that I can do things that I'm really passionate about. So for example, I filmed these are baby steelhead in one of our creeks. And where they're located, you can kind of see there's a little bit of a churn happening right here. That's the spillway of a fish passage barrier that's on the reserve. So it's a partial barrier. So during years of high flow, fish can get over it. And we have about 4 miles of spawning habitat upstream of the barrier. During a low flow year like this year, fish are trapped right there at the base of that barrier. And so I managed to cobble together money from various agencies, both regionally and state agencies, to get money to replace that barrier. And then we're going to turn it into a research opportunity. National Fish and Wildlife Service has tagged 75 little baby fish just upstream of the barrier a couple of years ago. And we're going to put an antenna across at the base of the new bridge. And so we'll be able to record any fish that are coming up that are tagged. And so it kind of gives us a sense of the number of fish that are able to return to this area. So, you know, just kind of an example of the types of like projects that I become sort of personally invested in and can help sort of push forward. And it's very satisfying because you kind of see these things come to fruition, and it's great. Oops. And this is a nightmare of a graph, but I made this for a, what was it? I guess it was like a 4-H club. And it was like, they wanted to know the path, like, how did you get to do the thing that you're doing? And so I started kind of writing it all down, and it's quite insane. And so, you know, the take-home message is, when I was in high school, I kind of knew the things I liked, working with animals, being outside. And I imagine many people who are listening to me talk about this sort of had the same kind of interests. But to me, it was never clear what the next step was. So I sort of thought I can be a zookeeper, or I can be a veterinarian. I sort of thought those are the two jobs that I could really potentially do if these are the things I'm interested in. And my family, my parents are both school teachers. There aren't scientists in my family anywhere. And so I didn't know the system. And I think that for a lot of students, particularly students who are coming from sort of more, I guess, working class family backgrounds, that it's not necessarily clear the path that you need to be on to do the job that you ultimately want to do. And so that's why this is this winding sort of nightmare of a path. The critical thing for me, my grandmother died when I was, I guess, a sophomore in college, and she left me some money. And with that money, I did a study abroad in Namibia. And that was the thing that changed everything for me, because that exposed me to doing field research. It exposed me to sort of developing a research project and kind of the full sort of process that we think of when we think of research. And without that experience, I'm not quite sure I would have landed where I am now. And so, you know, I changed my major, and I prioritized traveling and doing research in other places, and ultimately went to Madagascar and Honduras, and I did all these things, and then went to grad school. And then when I graduated, so I graduated in 2008, I just as the financial crash was happening. And I thought, my God, this is like the worst possible job market ever in the history of mankind. And guess what, guys? Like, I was wrong. This is the worst possible job market. So, so I've kind of floated around for a while, and I couldn't quite work out exactly what I wanted to do. But like, I always had my ear open for these field stations jobs. One thing that I'll just point out is that I worked at the San Mateo Resource Conservation District. And if you haven't heard of or don't know much about the resource conservation districts, they used to be called the Soil Conservation Service back in the 30s, sort of around the Dust Bowl time. And they're really an interesting entity. And it's kind of like half nonprofit, half agency. And so they basically help ranchers and farmers and natural resource managers deal with various complications that come along with doing those sorts of things. So they do invasive plant removal, they help you write grants, they do these fish passage barrier removal projects, they find money for people to dig ponds on their land, like all of these sorts of things. It was a really cool, this job came up, and I was here for all of 1 month. So I was that person that gets hired for a month at a job. This job came up, but it was such a cool experience. And I, you know, even having only been there a month, I was able to use a lot of that experience here in this job and trying to manage our resources. So I would encourage you, there's a lot of them around. I want to say there's one in every county. I'm not entirely sure that's true. So I just want to encourage you all to think about resource conservation districts and check them out. And then the other thing that I'll just mention is, oh, there we go, is this part. So representation matters. It really matters. And I know I'm dating myself, although Barbara already kind of did that. Thanks for nothing. But these were the people that were on TV that were doing these jobs I wanted to do. Not all of them were on TV, but for the most part, like this was the group of people that I saw that I wanted to emulate. And it's such a limited representation of the world. And so part of the reason that I felt my options were so limited, so I'm biracial, my dad's Black and my mom's white. I never ever saw anybody that looked like me doing a job like this, ever. At the field stations I went to, even traveling, you know, there just wasn't anybody that I felt I could relate to. And so, you know, the default for that is to feel like there's not a place for you here. And so one of the real values I think of the job I'm doing now is that I can kind of be that person for some students when they come through and see that it's not only white men that do this job. And that, you know, the diversity of experience and background and all of that stuff is really, really valuable. And it brings just a different perspective to the table. And it's something that, you know, I know is sort of on the front of everybody's mind right now, but I just want to underscore that. And those of you who are people of color, who are trying to break into a career in natural resource management, I certainly understand how difficult that can be when you don't have a sense of how you fit into the whole scheme of things. And so I did just quickly last night, this was my 10 p.m. project last night, I went on, NSF keeps a log of all of the engineering and science degree recipients by race and ethnicity. And so they do it in kind of these 10-year buckets. And the combination of disciplines are a little weird. So I combined agricultural sciences and natural resources, which is one bucket, with biological sciences and biomedical sciences, which are kind of different things, but that was another bucket. So I combined those numbers together. And then I looked up what the sort of each racial and ethnic group, like what the percentage was of the US population in those years. Basically, so in essence, you know, in 2008, 59.7% of the degree recipients of a bachelor's degree in these topics were white, whereas white people made up 60.3% of the population of the US. So if this was representative, you would expect these numbers to be the same. So that's kind of what I did, just to kind of see, because when I was in grad school, all of those many years ago, diversity and diversifying the natural resource sciences was a real thing that people were talking about. And it was kind of disheartening actually to do this little exercise and realize that things haven't changed that much in 10 years. You know, there've been some real gains for some groups, like Latino students were only 7% of the bachelor's degree recipients in 2008, but 13% in 2018, so that's pretty good. For Black students, it's completely flat. And then for Native American students, there's a drop off. So it's, you know, it's kind of a mixed bag. And then when I looked at master's degrees too, it's slightly better, but not much. And so, you know, it just kind of calls into question. So one of the reasons that I started with that representation matters is that, you know, there's been a lot of interest in recruiting diverse faculty and diverse students in schools and things. And, you know, some of those efforts are really super successful. Some of them are not quite as successful. And so, you know, I put this up here just to kind of plant in the back of your mind that there are ways to measure the success of some of these programs, and to think about, like, how do we need to switch? What are we not doing that we could be doing? And, you know, in my mind, having been one of these students in a degree program where I never saw anybody, at least in my undergrad degree, I don't even think I had a Black professor at any point in college or grad school. But, you know, as one of these students that came up always feeling like a little bit out of place, you know, it's a little upsetting to see how little progress has been made over the years. And part of that may be that, you know, it's just part of the conversation now that we have groups like the Sierra Club and, you know, the National Park Service. And, you know, the basis for a lot of these organizations, maybe not the basis for a lot of them is the exclusion of people. And, you know, in the West, that took the form of Native Americans. And it's like, well, let's move all the Native Americans out so we can make this a national park so white people can come in and look at the animals. And that's kind of been the feel. And so this graph was floating around for a while, and it's the percentage of PhDs identifying as African American in the US. And evolutionary biology is way down here, you know, with music composition and classics and Mideast studies. And it's pretty sad. It's a pretty sad state of affairs. And, you know, I'm hopeful that things are getting better. And so this past September, I was a part of a group that organized Black Mammalogist Week on Twitter, just to kind of give some exposure to, you know, students who are in high school and middle school and undergrads, that we're out here and we're doing these sorts of jobs. And even if we're not at your particular university, you know, it's really important to kind of make those connections and network a little bit, and just to kind of give folks a sort of a sense of belonging that sometimes can be hard if you're the only brown face in a room. And so, you know, this is a study from 2010 that found that Black students are more likely to persist in STEM majors if they have a STEM course taught by a Black instructor. And to me, that feels like, of course, you know, and this I saw online and it really resonated with me, that being the only Black person in the space has never made me feel exceptional. It's only ever made me feel alone. And so it's kind of a depressing note in retrospect to leave it on. But I just want, you know, I think it's important to communicate that that there are those of us out here who are using our position in a way that hopefully is a bit of a hand up to some of these students that are coming up and feel a little bit displaced in some of these disciplines. And I know that it's hard and can be very isolating. But I think that there's sort of the sea change that's happening now. I mean, I know in the reserve system this is happening, and I think across campuses throughout the US, and you know, that's really, really exciting. And I'm just absolutely thrilled to be in the position that I'm in, that allows me to interact with, you know, hundreds of students every year, and to put a different face on what a field biologist looks like and the type of work that we can do. And with that, I'll just leave it. I will mention that so American Society for Mammalogists is gonna host and administer a BIPOC scholarship that we set up during Black Mammalogist Week. We need to raise, I think 60 grand is the amount that we need to raise to get it endowed. But any amount, you know, there will be a process to apply for scholarship funds. And it's pretty wide ranging for support for students who are interested in going to conferences or small research awards. I would encourage you, this is on GoFundMe, if you're interested in contributing, do that. Otherwise, keep an eye out at the American Society for Mammalogists when the call goes out for awards, if you fit within that category. I'll also mention that Hastings has a small research award that we give every year. We give it to undergrads and grad students, up to $1,500 in expenses toward work that you do here at Hastings. And so if anybody's interested in any of that, you're welcome to email me. I should have put that on here. Or you can find me through the Hastings website. And I can certainly put anybody on the list when time comes to put that call out. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them pretty well on time. Okay, let's see if there's anything in there. Okay, the Acorn Woodpecker video can be shared as a link. Yeah, totally. Yeah, Barbara, do you have a question?
Yeah, and I'm kind of asking this for the students in the room, but I was just thinking, like, if you could go back in time on your pathway, do you think you would have changed anything, or do you think that kind of circuitous path you know, was purposeful and actually helped you get to where you are?
That's a really good question. I think a lot about, for a long time, I thought that I should have stopped after a master's, that I didn't need a PhD for the work that I wanted to do. So my PhD work was pretty esoteric, and I really ultimately wanted a job that was more applied. And I think a master's track probably would have been a smarter route for me. You know, in retrospect now, like I think the PhD is helpful where I am today, because it gives me access to PI status so I can write grants and stuff. But, you know, minus that part of it, I think I probably would have been better off in a master's program rather than a PhD program. But at the time, you know, like UC doesn't do a great job giving you a sort of the context for the sorts of jobs that you do with the various degrees. University of Washington was actually quite good with that stuff, but so I didn't really have a great understanding at the time, you know, that I mean, ultimately, if I wanted a job in an agency or something, I would have been better served with a master's. So that's one thing that I would have changed. Somebody's asking if we have a feral pig control program. Not an official one, but we have a feral pig problem. Because we're sort of in the midst of this fire situation, and I showed you the picture of the part of Hastings that burned. So we also were at the confluence of two fires. So there was another fire that was burning in an area called Kashawa that's right near here. So that came within like a mile of our border. So and then the Dolan fire in Big Sur was like 3 miles away. So it was kind of a really horrible time. But all of that burned land, I think, has forced the pigs down into the unburned areas, and it is a problem. Oh, look at all these feral pig removal volunteers. Thanks, guys. I'll keep you posted. I have a couple folks that are working on it. But if push comes to shove, there may be a broader call for feral pig removal. So somebody asked, how do you cultivate relationships with the surrounding private ranching managers? It's actually been kind of complicated. So Hastings, how do I say this diplomatically? Hastings has a reputation locally for being very insular and sort of closed and sort of kind of paternalistic, like, and Hastings researchers have a reputation of doing what they want to do when they want to do it, which sometimes means trespassing. And so we've had a difficult relationship with the neighbors around that issue historically. And so the thing that I did that I think was most useful is to come in and take responsibility for that and to deal with it. Because I mean, I don't care if you have a 40,000 acre property or a 4,000 acre property or a 4 acre property or a 4,000 square foot property, that property line has to mean something. And so taking responsibility for that, addressing it, and opening up sort of the lines of communication if there's a problem was pretty critical. I really enjoy the folks out here because they have such a different perspective. Like I grew up in the city, like this is not sort of being in a really rural setting. I've lived in rural areas before, but this is really very rural. And, you know, it's just kind of meeting people where they are and talking about their lives and their families and their children and getting together for brandings and things like that. You know, it's really important for me to become part of the community personally in order for Hastings to become sort of part of the community. So that's sort of a strategic decision in some ways, but also I think it really serves us well in the long term because of relationships with the neighbors, particularly during the fires. We had neighbors on both sides that were, after days of pushing fire around by themselves, because there were so many fires and CAL FIRE was spread so thin, we had no response out here. And so they did all this work on their own properties, and they both cut fire lines to protect us from the burns on their property, knowing that we just didn't have the capacity to do that. So, you know, there's 2 employees out here. So there's me, and then there's a land steward. And he's actually the battalion chief of the local fire district. So during the fires, he was on a fire working. So it was really me and a garden hose, which could have been better, could have been way worse. But so, you know, those relationships with the neighbors really, really come in handy at a time like that. So it's a really important part of what we're doing. Any other questions in there? Blah, 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 blah. I think that's good. Does anybody else have questions? I'll send the Acorn Woodpecker video. It's actually Cal Academy made it. It's, I think, Biographic is the sort of series. And it's a really, really well done video. It's like 8 minutes long though, so it's kind of a push to get it in a talk. But it's a really cool breeding system, and the work has been pretty innovative that they've done here. So if anybody's interested in that stuff, I recommend you take a peek at it. We actually have a lot of film crews that come out from various, we've had Nat Geo here, BBC was here, they're making a Green Planet series, and so they were here filming oaks. And then there's another production company that made this fantastic video about ground squirrels. There was another one too. We have PBS Nature's coming in this spring to film too. So the woodpeckers are a major draw for people because they're so accessible, and they know so much about the histories of all of them. Oh, there we go. Thanks, Brian, for that link. If students are interested in potentially using the reserve system for their science, but don't know what options and resources are available. So the UC NRS website, gosh, I should have put all of this on here. So it's ucnrs.org. And you can also just Google University of California Natural Reserve System. They do a pretty good job of describing the facilities at each of the sites. And so they really range a lot. And they can also give you like elevation, and you have lat long, and most of us have websites where you can get maps and things like that. And then, you know, part of my job and the job of the field station managers is to field questions from prospective students and to try to provide some guidance about appropriate places to do the work that you want to do. And so if I had someone that came to me and was looking for a specific species that we don't have here, I might recommend they go, you know, to Big Creek or someplace else that may have that. So we really do, I mean, we don't function as a network because we're all administered by different campuses. We don't function as a network, I think, quite the way that we could potentially, but we're all kind of in this together. And I think that you'll find if you start working with some of the reserves, that there's a lot of, I guess, reciprocity. Like, we really want everybody to do well. And so all of the reserve managers will be a really good resource if you're interested in working at any of the field stations. The current status of the magpies on the reserve. Not many. We see them like 1 or 2 periodically. But they're close. So there's a population of yellow-billed magpies on the neighboring property to the west. So we see those pretty regularly, but they just don't kind of stray over here. I'm hopeful that that will happen at some point. Yeah, I also heard that there was some incidental poisoning that happened years and years ago and kind of wiped the magpie population out, although they're still our official logo. So the only yellow-billed magpie you may see here may be on our sign, but we're with them in spirit. Did somebody else have Daniel, did you have a question?
Dr. Hunter, thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it. So here's a question that is somewhat selfish, but you may have a bunch of really interesting exposure to because you see a lot of other people teaching their field courses at where you are, right? So you see a range of different approaches from different institutions, different instructors. Mm-hmm. What's like 1 or 2 things that someone could do to make their field courses more inclusive of students from groups traditionally excluded from the field sciences?
That's a really good question. I think outreach, you know, really trying to recruit students aggressively. I mean, not too aggressively, but you know, there's really the sense that these places are not for, I mean, even when I go through the Hastings story and I'm looking at Joseph Grinnell and I'm looking at Annie Alexander and all these people doing these things, and you know, they're setting up these places for the study of nature. And then I think about my community and what was happening in my community in the 1930s, and it was like, you know, it just kind of cements in your mind like how far behind the sort of baseline you're starting when you have this kind of these cultural values around outdoor recreation and, you know, taking the time, bird watching and all of these sorts of things. And it's when you don't have that kind of cultural value passed down through time, it's really hard to get into it because it can be quite unwelcoming. And so I think that if you, I mean, even just the language around like this, the invitation to speak here, when Frank sent me that email, like it just was like, wow, these guys are really doing, you know, it just feels welcoming in a way that, you know, not every invitation does. And so I think if you're conscious in your language and recruit students strategically, that it might be, I don't know, it can be tricky, particularly if you don't have like a huge population of students, you know, of color or whatever, to recruit from. Although, and I think using places like this are kind of nice because it's helping to do some of that bridge work. If you're not, like I didn't grow up hunting and fishing and backpacking and all that. It's like, it's just not something that you know, I spent my time outside in parks. And so when time comes to when, you know, I get to college or grad school and people want to go backpacking, I'm like, I don't know, like, I don't really know how to do that. Like, that's not, you know, and so a place where there are facilities that are don't require a skill set to operate. I think that's an easier sell for people too. I don't know. I mean, it's a tough question for sure. So I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much. I appreciate your insight.
Oh yeah, and Laura made the point too that resources can be quite, like field courses typically have a fee associated with them, you know, just for transportation and housing and that kind of stuff. Not oftentimes they do. And so any resources to provide to students to help kind of defray some of those costs. And transportation can be tricky too. So any scholarship help, or, you know, cost sharing help would be great too. And I'm down for stuff like that for sure. You know, I mean, we have our set use fees, but there is some flexibility there. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about doing is a kind of a reserve management internship program. Because we have so much housing, you know, we could provide housing for somebody and a stipend for someone to come and work here for 2 months, 3 months, something like that, and get some experience doing some of these things that not everybody has experience with. So, you know, when you go through grad school and you get your PhD, like that means you have experience with the research part and maybe some research with the grant writing part and maybe some research with the teaching part. But that doesn't mean you can replace a hot water heater or unclog a toilet or, you know, change a tire or use a chainsaw. You know, it's like so those are like special skills that a lot of people just sort of through their life develop, and a lot of people don't have an opportunity to do that kind of stuff. And so, you know, that's something that I think about too, is providing opportunities for people both through funding to get some of that experience, but also using that as kind of a vehicle to reach out to different types of groups. Let's see, are there barn owl nest boxes in the past? We don't have any barn owl nest boxes, although we could use them. We have a lot of gophers and we have a lot of mice. Student clubs would be great to introduce students to outdoor recreation before overnight field classes are offered. Oh, this is another suggestion for you. Samantha says student clubs would be great to introduce students to outdoor recreation before overnight field classes are offered, or being clear that no prior experience with camping, et cetera, is needed, because that can be quite intimidating. So that's, you know, it's like I think a lot is, you know, that it can be super, super intimidating to think that you're relying on your own skill set to sort of stay alive. And so, you know, anything to kind of help calm nerves about the basic skills required to do like a field course, I think would be really good too. Are there any plans or interests to reintroduce indigenous burning practices to the reserve? There's actually a grad student. We have this fantastic project that is on the cusp of happening. They're coming in June. It's a researcher from Michigan State who's interested in looking at indigenous use of fish. And so they want to excavate a couple of sites, Esselyn sites that we know about with the support of the tribe. And to look for evidence of salmonid bones. So they're interested in steelhead, but he's also interested in seeing if there are any coho bones, because we're kind of, the sort of southern reach of coho may have extended down to the Carmel River at some point. And so this research is coming to do that. He also has 2 graduate students, one of whom is interested in looking at the indigenous use of fire on the landscape. And so that's something that's sort of happening. I would really, we've really recently made this connection with the tribe, and I think that anything we can do to sort of broaden the researchers that use the site to include more sort of cultural anthropology, archaeological stuff would be really great, because that's stuff that the tribe is really interested in as well. And we have the resources and the capacity here to do that work in a way that those sites can be protected in the long term. So anything along those lines, I think would be really, really great going forward. Any other questions? I think that might be it. Oh, Barbara.
Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I was wondering if you could tell everybody more about your research with the skunk taxidermy.
Oh, sure.
That's a cool project.
It was a cool project, and skunks are, so I give a lot of talks about skunks. So skunks are one of those species that everybody knows and everybody relates to. So you have like, they're really great for like public talks and stuff, because everybody knows them. And the project that I did, so I was looking at how a predator knows that a skunk is a skunk. And so I was interested whether or not like the black and white coloration or the body shape or some combination of the two is critical for a predator sort of recognizing and avoiding a skunk. And so what I did is I had these taxidermy mounts that I made of skunks and gray foxes. And I had some foxes that I dyed to look like skunks, and I had some skunks that I dyed to look like foxes. And I put them out with infrared video cameras and a food bait. And I recorded the behavior of the animals that visited them. And I was looking for things like wariness, like, are they nervous around skunks? Do they just like approach them? Do they make contact with them? All that kind of stuff. So I had all these behavioral variables that I was looking at. And then I used 10 different wilderness sites throughout California. So I used 6 or 7 of the UC reserves, and then a couple of land trust properties and things like that. And it was really a nice, I covered a pretty big geographic area in the state, and I just happened, so I was also surveying the carnivore population at each of these sites, and I happened to have selected sites that varied in the local abundance of skunks. And because that was kind of a secondary question to me, is like, can you predict the behavior of potential predators around skunk colored or skunk shaped mounts, given the local abundance of skunks at each site? So is avoidance of skunks a learned behavior? So if a predator is existing in a landscape where there are no skunks, how readily can they recognize, that black and white coloration or that distinctive body shape that's so emblematic of their whole, warning system and their noxious anal secretions, which is one of my favorite phrases. And so I ultimately found that there is a pretty strong interaction between the behavior of animals at skunk-colored mounts, given the local abundance of skunks. So in places where skunks were really common, animals avoided them almost entirely. They were really nervous around them. It took them a really long time to if they made contact with the food bait, like it took them a really long time to get there. There was a lot of confusion. And in places where skunks were rare, they got hammered all the time. There was animals dragging them away, rolling on them, running right up to them, eating the food bait, that kind of stuff. And so, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One of which is that, theoretically, and I won't get too far into the weeds here, but theoretically, in order for sort of that initial warning colored animal to evolve, there has to be some innate avoidance of warning colored prey by predators. So if you're a sort of a squirrel sized animal and you're gray and you're cryptic and it's hard for animals to catch you and eat you because you're gray and you blend into your surroundings, and suddenly, you know, your son is born and he's black and white, and that black and whiteness really, really stands out. It makes them so easy to see. It makes them really easy to discriminate from other species that are around them. You know, that animal is going to be a major target for predators because, you know, by virtue of that coloration, they're so easy to detect. And so, you know, there are theoretically like the rationale for explaining like how that initial sort of mutant evolves and how, you know, is there a link between the defense and the coloration, like how does that all work? But there wasn't a lot of evidence for a learned response to warning coloration. And part of that might have been that most of the work that had been done was looking at animals in a lab. So it wasn't natural predator-prey dyads. It were, you know, birds and colored crumbs. So it wasn't like that sort of co-evolution business, like wasn't something that was happening. And so that was kind of why it was interesting, is because it turns out that there is a pretty significant learned component to that. And so Ken's asked a question about spotted skunks. And so spotted skunk populations have generally gone down over the last several decades, and, you know, based on sort of harvest records and things like that. And one of those reasons may be that if you imagine that there has to be some threshold density or abundance of skunks on the landscape in order to reinforce that signal for the predators. And if places where skunks are common or places where skunks are rare, they get hammered all the time, you can imagine a disease event or something that sort of wipes out the local population. Like that population has to build back to that threshold level in order for that signal to be particularly useful. And spotted skunks are so small. And so a striped skunk can be attacked by an animal and have a chance to spray that animal and escape. A spotted skunk is much more likely to be killed in that initial attack, and therefore, you know, not be able to deploy their defense and help reinforce that learning. So sorry if that was a little, but it's a really cool system, and it's a really cool, I mean, I think the fact that skunks are like the most behaviorally dominant carnivore is pretty amazing, at least in, you know, the Americas. I mean, I've seen videos of them chasing bears off food. They chase mountain lions off kills. They just do their thing and live their lives, and they don't really worry about the consequences, and I appreciate that. I respect the hustle. So skunks are pretty great.
Great. Well, Jen, thank you so much for coming. That was a great talk. I really appreciate you sticking around for the questions at the end as well.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thanks, guys. You know, it's always nice to kind of reach new audiences, so please come here. You know, we're this taxpayers of the state of California fund this place, and so this place is open to all of you. So if anybody's interested at all, just reach out. You can come and have a look around and see if you see something that you're interested in. You know, I'm happy to help with any of that. So please feel free to reach out, and hopefully we'll see some of you out here soon. Thanks, guys.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.